Hello everyone, my name is Jose Calderon, and my research is about the effects of Ebola on African economies. Okay, so what we have here is my presentation, and as you can see, my research question is, how has Ebola affected the economy of Sierra Leone compared to other African countries and their own economies from the years from 2013 to 2016? So here we are. We have the first of three groups of cornerstone works with arguments presented here. The first group of these works talk about the concerns of the effects that Ebola would have on the psychological or mental state of not just citizens but healthcare workers. Some also talk about how organizations or governments may have done poorly and what they should do about them. The second cornerstone group talks about the concerns related to predicting how worse the Ebola outbreak would get and what lessons the outbreak could teach societies, or researchers for that matter. The final cornerstone group is with the sources talking about countries funding healthcare and changes in policies, opportunities to help prevent the spread of Ebola, and crisis of tourism management, with one of them also acknowledging the issue of cultural sensitivity in local populations during the Ebola crisis. Moving on, here's my research design. I'm using two methods, which are comparative analysis and process tracing. Comparative analysis is a qualitative method, which is using one thing and using another and comparing them, looking at them both to conceptualize what's different and what's similar about them. Process tracing is also qualitative and pretty much comparative, but is actually going more in depth as evidence and comparing the evidence and looking at the outcomes as well. So the countries I'm using for my cases are Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Nigeria, Senegal, and Mali. The timeline for this is 2013 and 2016, which was the time for the Ebola outbreak. And I'm going to be looking at GDP numbers and comparing them. So the GDP numbers are part of my results to look at. What I think is that countries with more cases of Ebola are more likely to have their economies plumble down. So for the countries with less cases of Ebola, they could find ways to prevent Ebola from spreading across their own countries and upon their own people. What we have here is my first image, and this one represents the several cases of Ebola that have been reported in each country. So this is basically a bar graph on each country in the x-axis, and the y-axis is basically the number of cases of Ebola, which is in each country. And this bar graph conceptualizes how far Ebola spread in each of them. So what we have here is Sierra Leone, and the smallest being Nigeria, Senegal, and Mali compared to these three. So for my second image, what you see there is basically a translation of the previous one. This tells what the number of cases reported from each country are. And it also shows Sierra Leone carries the most cases, and while the least carried are in Senegal, which is 1. So this final image, this is data for the GDP by country, as you can see here, and years shown tell what happened to each economy over time. Low GDP countries fail to restore their initial numbers because of more cases. High GDP countries recovered and surpassed their initial numbers. Neutral GDP countries restored initial numbers but lower than they previously were. From what I was able to look at from these results, the ones with higher cases of Ebola had their economies falling. The countries with fewer cases consisted of one economy falling, another neutral, and last having their economy higher than in 2013. What this means is that countries should look at what those countries did to prevent cases of any contagious diseases from spreading across them, and how they were able to defend their cities and economies, as most importantly. So, the limitations in my research were that I struggled to find enough data for my research. And what I mean by this is that I tried finding data, which I searched up Ebola by country and economy, but that didn't really work out very much. So I decided to kind of separate it, which I searched up GDP by country and Ebola cases per country. And it also related to one of my initial reasons, lack of email responses, where I have to email the authors to ask questions of where to find data, but when I did it, I got no response. And those were the authors of the sources I chose. And it also led to this. The data for Ebola cases by country was hard to find. It took me a bit, but I was lucky enough to get the ones I got. And I chose only 6 countries for my cases because 3 of them had very high cases of Ebola and the other 3 weren't very high, which leads me to my next one. The year timeline was short. It was between 2013 and 2016. And that time was when Ebola was relevant due to the time of the epidemic or outbreak. My future directions are to continue finding sources of data. And the data I'm finding is Ebola cases on each country. I would want to see if there are more sources, and which leads to the second is to operationalize them and check if that source of data can align with the most recent I was able to find, which is the one I used, as you can see in the presentation. The third direction I'm going towards is looking at more African countries touched by Ebola, and I'm doing this to look at more cases to see if independent variable 1 could actually align with dependent variable 2, which is basically a different result from my independent variable. So that's kind of an example of that. And which also kind of leads to my next one, is see how their economies changed. That way I gather more data. Now onto the oral defenses. The first method I chose was comparative analysis, and it aligns with my research purpose by me choosing how each economy from their respective countries was changing when the Ebola outbreak was going on by how fast it was spreading in each country. My second was process tracing. It would be based on the timeline from 2013 for the found cases of Ebola in each country and what happened with their economy over the years. A method that I considered using but then rejecting in the process was correlation/regression, due to how poorly this would relate with my comparative analysis. And another reason is I would have to focus on how my variables connect to each other, but then my research purpose is least of concern for it. From what I could gather from the information I found, my implications regarding to the real world could help researchers see what a country could do to protect its economy and fight against Ebola and other contagions. Some actions that could be taken are closing borders, establishment of travel restrictions, and being aware of what is going on in neighboring countries. This is what I consider an issue by at any time in any place based on seeing these results. From what I hypothesize, government should be more cautious into what kind of contagion is being dealt with and what potential impact this could lead to. What I could do with an additional 3 months for my research would be adding another method in place to benefit my research, to give me more time to think of what to do with it. I would add another method because I want to see which independent variables match with which dependent variables. This may also lead me to gathering more variables because it tells me that Ebola is not really the only reason the economy would change, or any economy would change. Okay, so it seems my hypothesis is kind of right because the countries with lesser cases of Ebola, one had their economy suffering, the other had theirs all right, and the others pretty much doing great. But the other three weren't so well. So that's all I have to say, and thanks for watching.